I want to do two things today. The first is get yourself to wrap your head around how risk to pollinating insects occurs, and then I want to do a brief review of what at least I know of the risks associated with insecticide treatments to protect ash or to pollinating insects. So to begin with, we all know that the risk of something is not only the toxicity of the insecticide, but the likelihood of exposure. All the products that we've talked about today, if you look at the environmental hazard sections of the pesticide label, they will be listed as highly toxic or toxic to bees. So that's just one part of the equation. There is the likelihood of exposure. With pollinating insects, there's really kind of two things to keep in mind. With butterflies and moths, it's whether their caterpillars feed on ash. Because ash flowers do not provide nectar, there's no risk of nectar going into butterflies or moths. And with bees, it's whether they collect, whether there's toxic residues in the pollen. So they will collect the pollen off the flowers. What we know when it comes to butterflies and moths is there's a handful of butterflies whose caterpillars will feed on ash. And there's maybe a dozen or so species that have been associated with eating leaves of ash trees. It's not a huge portion of the butterfly and moth fauna. It's not a big heavy hitter when it comes to those communities. Nevertheless, there is none of the butterflies and moths that I was able to find are either threatened or endangered. So that brings us around to the bees and the risk of insecticide finding its way into the pollen and the bees collecting it. Now there have been only a few studies looking at, that I was able to find, and there's more out east that I just wasn't able to access. So when it comes to emamectin benzoate, there have been studies. There's a study in Colorado where they looked at both soil and tree injections, and the amounts that are found in the pollen, in a spring application, the amounts that are found in the pollen are not of levels to be concerned to bees. They're very low in concentration. I was unable to find studies looking at imidacloprid specifically, but a couple things to mention about it. So people have been looking at imidacloprid on trees for years, and you can remember the big incident that we had that arborists know about in the state, the linden tree incident, where treatments were applied months before there was, deaths to the bumblebees. And so we know with imidacloprid it doesn't reside in trees for a long period of time. Studies that have been done on imidacloprid and bees are mixed. So some studies have shown, all of them show that there's some kind of long residual. But still, so 8 to 10 months before the tree comes into bloom is generally regarded as a safe period. But the studies are mixed on this. Some studies have fall applications with no measurable residues in the flowers. And some show, when you start to push the treatments out into the fall, there are measurable residues that are problematic. So it's a little bit mixed, and it likely is a product of the rate, the tree species, and the environmental conditions. But the one thing I do want to put on the table here, and maybe just to kind of put things into focus, is how important is ash pollen to bee communities. And there have been studies in Ohio, there have been studies in Colorado, and it shows that the amount of pollen being collected by bees from ash tends to be relatively low. And I suspect in Western Oregon it's even lower. You can think of the competition for bees at that time of year, April, when those flowers come into bloom. There's willow, there's maple, there's all sorts of flowering shrubs. And although we don't have an estimate of how much pollen is coming in, my sense is it's going to be relatively low. It'd be worth looking into this. The last thing I want to mention is there have been studies to look at bee communities with blocks of trees that have been treated with imidacloprid, ash trees treated with imidacloprid, and blocks that haven't. And there does not seem to be any impact on the abundance of bees in those communities. So long and short of it is, I think the issue that's on the table is imidacloprid as a soil treatment, or diateperin as a treatment on the bark of the soil. And my sense is that the risks probably are relatively low. And as arborists, the important thing to keep in mind is that when you're doing soil drench applications, to make sure it's not, in that zone where the drench is being applied, there isn't a highly bee attractive plant growing, because it will take it up, and that's where I think the big risks will occur. Thank you. My sense is that when I think about the spring fauna, the spring bees, the rare bees we have, they are really targeting willow and maple. Like those are the two tree species that most bees go to. I think it's worth looking into to see if, looking at some of the loads of a species like Osmia or mason bees and seeing if they're. But actually, people have gone through mason bee as a kind of a surrogate for a solitary bee. And it is, there's been studies up in Seattle, and there's been studies down in California as well. It's willow heavy. They really love willow. So my sense is that we have so much blooming early on. There's two issues. We have these urban trees, which have, there's clearly an insect community around these urban trees. But we have, likely, when I'm talking about butterflies and moths, we're talking about wild ash and those wild ash communities. But still, I kind of want to, keep it out of the wild ash populations as much as possible. So if it means going heavier in urban areas, so be it. The studies that have been done with honeybees specifically, you see some ash pollen coming in, but it's really overloaded with all the other spring sources of pollen. So one doesn't, you can sort of track bees, but it's kind of hard to do. So my sense is what you described is going on. There are much more attractive sources of pollen and nectar at that time of year. Because we're talking about blooms starting in April, finishing off around that May 1st period where treatment should be going on. And so most of the flowering is done anyways at that point. So I say that May 1st treatment period really the risk gets really, really low at that point because there's a full year for those residues to dissipate.
Specifically with emamectin benzoate, which again is the preferred thing, and I think this is one of the reasons, we treat after flower. So we treat once the ash flower pretty early, then we treat during full leaf out. So they're pretty much done flowering. They're done flowering by the time we go into treat. And then, the studies I think show after about, 10 months, it starts to wane in that plant part. But then the thing with emamectin benzoate is we're doing that for 2 or 3 years, and what we see is it actually doesn't move into the new leaves or the new flowers or flower parts pollen in very high. If it does, it's very, very, very low. So again, it's that frequency component of toxicity. It is, with emamectin benzoate, actually quite low for multiple, chemistry reasons.
Yeah, from what I'm really keen next year to go out and trap some pollen in Oregon, just to, at least to kind of nail that question down for the state. I think both the public, conservationists, beekeepers would just feel a lot better to know that this, the risk is relatively low. I think if you go to Oregon Flora, there's a really great appendix in Oregon Flora at the back with butterfly host plant associations. I think there's 2 butterflies that have associations with ash. It's a low number. Ash is such a predominant part of riparian areas that inevitably there are insect communities tied deeply to those, to the ash. Maybe not even directly to the ash, but to the plant community that the ash anchors down. And my sense is that there's going to be some impacts.